And we are live. Welcome everybody to episode 5 of the MesaCast. One of my favorite things about it so far was that I think from myself and Udo, you can kind of tell what week it is of this cast, but Enrico looks exactly the same.
Of course.
I think I was shaved.
Himself.
Yeah. I was shaved on the first one. My hair probably didn't look like this. And then now this is what it's turning into. So it's perfect.
Good morning.
Good morning, everybody. We're here with Enrico and Udo, and today's cast is about coaching and maybe sharing some resources and just having a little bit of a conversation about coaching in the current situation, but also I think this extends to everybody who is trying to improve their own climbing and doesn't necessarily just, isn't just for the coaches that are working with other athletes. It's maybe just how to coach yourself, or if that's something that you care about, how to get better, or like how to do some self-analysis during this time. And kind of one of the main things that I wanted to start with today is some videos that we actually didn't get to last week, but from the conversation that we were having last week of mirrored boards, I was thinking, well, it's kind of a shame to have a mirrored board if you don't really do any sort of self-analysis with it, because I think that's really like one of the big values of it. And here's a video that Udo shared with me, and I'll just have it replaying here on a loop. But Udo, can you give us some context about this?
Yeah, this is the Belgium team in Stanweg and Cologne, and this is one of the few train to climb walls that exist. I think still. No, I don't know if there are any in the US. And these are the guys from Vata and 360 and Simple Climbing that try to come up with a strictly symmetrical wall for coordination training.
And this wall, so everything is laid out pretty much the same, and they tell you, okay.
I mean, on Stanweg they didn't build a new wall. It's too slabby. What you're seeing right now is that they're intended it for, I don't know how many degrees steeper, but slightly steeper. So that's so in so far they're a little bit different, the walls, but yes, there's one layout, and even with the holes, all the holes are layouted, and you with the wall comes a blueprint that tells you where to put everything.
I'm curious, so when you have a layout like this, I think even the stuff that just goes unnoticed, because I've had some issues with this in the past when we're training, is like the technical aspects of getting prepared for analysis like this. So maybe if you could talk a little bit about even just equipment.
I do I mean, first of all, it's important for something like this, if you really want to shed some light into symmetrical setups, we really want to have your camera as parallel as possible to avoid any parallax. So and don't in anything, if you want to analyze climbing movement, don't get creative in terms of the camera moves. So the lockdown camera on a tripod is your best option, and ideally in this like it is now, strictly facing the wall, as parallel as possible. And then these overlays were done in Final Cut, where I do all my editing. But if you for that you would need some interest in video editing. The same effect can be done in a program called Hudl, with a Huddle, HUDL technique. You can do these overlays on a smartphone. So it's really really easy to do nowadays. The interesting part is really how you cue your, in this case, 2 clips up. Now you get sometimes totally different results if you, for example, here, if you take the top hold as a reference, or if you take the start hold and when they leave the start hold, or when they get to the top hold as a reference, that might give you 2 totally opposite impressions of what's actually going on.
So yeah, it sounds like. What are some things that you're looking for that you would look for in something like
we had
this?
some fantastic revelations with this wall, and so, for example, people going like they come from left to right and they go to the top hold with their right hand, and when they go the opposite direction, they're still going with their right hand. And that means that their entire move, or even a sequence of moves are totally different. And the best part is that they weren't even aware of it. No, so I showed them the video, and they were like, "Oh, okay." And now the other side, okay, you see something? No, because it was so normal to them and their body image to do it this way. And this might work. In many cases, it does, but it also might not work. And in the competition scenario, might be that you don't even say you're going mostly in your training, you're going left to right, and then suddenly in the competition it's right to left, and you might not even be aware that you leave some options on the table, because it's just the unfamiliar direction. I've seen this many times, that like athletes have a lot of strategies in one direction, but not a whole lot into the other direction.
Yeah, I feel like if you tell people, oh, you try to throw something with your right hand and then try to throw something with your left hand, it looks completely different, and it's really obvious to the person, oh, this just feels really weird. But with climbing, it's a little less obvious unless you look at a video. Like maybe the shoulders don't like to rotate a certain way, the same, kind of like you're saying.
But
like,
it's but what I just meant with the cueing, it's very easy to not be aware of. Very often the problems start really early, and just the sequence of moves almost disguise the mistake. You know what I mean? That you start, as they say, on the wrong foot, and then 5 moves later you fall off on something. And for most athletes and even coaches, that really takes a lot of detective work to discover these things. But if you have a setup like this, the camera facing the wall, you can spend a lot of time analyzing, and I think it's totally worthwhile.
Yeah, without the overlay, it's pretty hard to tell from side to side too. I think like you said, even if there's a time difference, oh, you watch one video and then you watch the other video, it's probably going to be hard to distinguish.
Totally, yeah. I mean, there are many things. It's almost very often. It's also, if you stop it, can you stop it right there? Mm-hmm. No, just hypothetically, like even this is if you. What I did, for example, I flipped one video. So you have an overlay, that you have a strict overlay. You know what I mean? That you, if you flip one of the, if you just do an overlay, like before, you see the 2 variations from left to right, from right to left. But then if you flip one of the videos, it overlays it, lays it on the same body. I didn't do this in this clip, but this is also very interesting. And I think in Hoodle Technique you can do this. And there's also the app Coach's Eye that doesn't do the overlays, but you can do a lot of little refinements to how much it tells you. But yeah, the most important part is still, in my mind, is how you cue it up. It's really almost worthwhile to every contact the climber has to cue it up at this point. Say, for example, you cue it to the point when the left foot reaches this volume, and then play it from there. And that will give you a different impression than if you started 2 moves earlier and sync it up there.
So for example, in this video that we're looking at, you would kind of go through the video and say, okay, what's important to me right now is where this foot is hitting, where this foot's going to hit the volume here. And then you try to sync.
I think most likely, if I go quickly, I sync it to the top hold. Let's see if it's synced to the top hold. Yeah, like not.
Yeah, and you can see the strategies were completely different, and like
totally, like totally. And this is very typical. And again, one doesn't necessarily have to be better or worse than the other. And you know, like, and these differences on our body size, they're very, there might even be an evolutionary plus at one point in our development, because the question is really why we develop this dominance of one side of the body. The interesting part is that when it comes to following through a movement, or when you cross midline, then you see a lot of differences. And again, often one side is really competent and the other not so much.
So
at least as a competitor, you want to know.
Crossing midline, just for people so they can get an idea. So this would be crossing midline to the green hold. Essentially,
crossing
like
midline
left.
is actually the term is comes from our left side of the brain organizing the right side of the body and vice versa. And this is sounds really simple, and in a way it is, but it causes all kinds of problems. Like even when you're in front of your chest, you cross with your right hand, then your right hand is on your left side, and you have a slight confusion in your brain about that. You know, so there's a slight hesitation. Is the left side now responsible, or is it the right side that's responsible? And you see this really, this is a very deciding, distinguishing factor in especially in the modern bouldering, where you cross midline all the time. Like in traditional sport climbing, you go left, right, and you cross the midline, of course. But it's not, you don't have to do it very fast very often in sport climbing. And there's not so many acrobatic elements, you know, like in bouldering, it's really an important factor.
Do you, so this question's for Enrico, because you have your mirrored setup and you took a video that we saw. Do you have it, have you been doing it, you were kind of mentioning earlier, have you been doing any self-coaching or like looking to see if there's any differences from side to side?
Yeah, pretty much. I think, you know, if you are kind of, I would say, sensitive enough, you can self-coach yourself, just taking a look and about the feeling you have while climbing or after falling or while you're falling. And of course, you know, videotaping and recording your performance is, of course, something, you know, very, very, very useful, you know. And I would say, especially right now, there's a little bit more time, and usually maybe you are pretty much training by yourself at home, and it's very important to try to record yourself, and of course while climbing, but why not while you know, performing any single workout and whatever. I would say that could be very interesting to do the same on hangboard, so or campus board, or again, every single workout you can do that's symmetric, you can easily take a look on your dominance. And of course, you know, more coordination is involved, more you can see the differences and, you know, the weakness. I think one very important thing about working on mirror and symmetric movements on different sides is that it's not very common for climbing, because of course it's a situation sport. Every time we have different problems, different angles, different holds, and blah, blah, blah. But every single sport and situation sport, you know, as tennis, as basketball, as soccer. So you train the kind of the single movements, the single coordination on both sides, just to try to give, as Udo was mentioning, to give the athlete more option. Because otherwise, of course, if you're gonna dribble every time with your right hand, with your right foot, and moving from left to right, you're gonna be more readable from your opponent. And in climbing, if you are able just to do one move very well on your right side or going right, you're gonna limit so much your option, you know? And so I think working on symmetric boards and working on the two different sides is very important. And so you have to self-coach yourself on it, because you have to force yourself on reproducing the same movements on the opposite side where you are less dominant, and I would say more weak, not less strong. I think is more weak because you cannot control very properly.
Yeah, but if I may add one thing, with again, this is very often the problems are disguised. They're not so easy. Like when we talk about dominant hands or dominant body sides, now it's far less, far more complex than that. No, because especially in all things related to flagging, for example. Now, just if we would be asked to do a really like a poser flag, for a photo, and like really, so even then we would see that one side looks really good, really elegant. Now we almost Yanya-esque reflect really nice, and then the other side is maybe due to mobility issues, but also just sheer coordination, looks a little bit awkward. Like even if you watch people on the slack line, mostly like one leg pendle balances really nicely, the free leg, and the other leg is a little bit tighter. You have this, almost everybody has things like this. So, and it's not like something like slackline. You think, it's the leg I'm standing on that is weak or that's not good in balance. But it might be also the work of the opposing leg, the free leg, that is just not as competent in balancing. So, but it's, I think in these times, it's something really interesting to look for.
I think too, especially for self-coaching, the one thing that we miss out a little bit on is that they're, like you're saying, with the back leg, because you obviously can't see if you're facing one way on the slab. Like a lot of times I find that people don't know what their back leg is doing, and that's what peels them off the wall. And it's almost creating that connection for them visualization wise, where it's like they don't know what the back leg is doing, but if you asked like a really high level athlete what their back leg was doing when they fell, they would know, they would tell you. But for a lot of people, they just don't know. They're just like, I don't know what it was doing, show me. And then you show them, and then all of a sudden it helps build that connection of like, okay, this is where everything is going. And I think that's very important. Like here's the example when we talked about on the first podcast or the first webcast where we had this. Afterwards, I was like, hey, I want to show this video of like an idea that we had. And Udo was like, oh, you mean the ones that's been on Instagram from like 15 different people? And I was like, perfect. I mean, like if the one thing we learned is that it obviously no ideas are new ideas, but I think that's really cool, is just getting inspiration from what other people are doing. And if you guys can see this video, this is essentially what Udo is like cluing me in. Could you also provide some context for this video?
Yeah, this is Kata Sauerbein, a fantastic competitor herself, and now she's the coach of the Austrian youth team, and just her home training, and she has the wall in front of herself to really have a feedback of how her mobility is working. And I like this part. She also does this these little jumps that I think I already talked about a little bit, and you can tell that she is inspired by some climbing situations. She's a very well traveled, very good rock climber too, and I think I'm sure that was her first attempt, and I'm also sure that she didn't put a whole lot of thoughts into it, but maybe just took inspiration from climbing situations.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's been really challenging, obviously, right now is that everything is always like if you're coaching and you have a good gym, things are readily available. It's like, oh, let me teach you how to do. If you want to cue some movement, it's like, okay, let's cue it on the wall. But things like this, I think, are like really is building. Like for me, I found it really difficult at the beginning, but then you start thinking, oh, okay, like a lot of these moves we can start queuing it in. So I'll share some video in a bit here, but I think what's so cool about this is like you were saying, it is basically, you can see what she's thinking a bit of like, oh, I'm going to mantle off of this holder, and it's the wall is forcing some sort of constraint of where the knee can go, and I think that's like something that's very important. And the other cool thing about it is that you could do exactly the same thing that we were talking about with the mirrored wall, where you take a video head on and kind of just start to build that same awareness of, well, my back leg on this side does something completely different than what it does on this side, and you wouldn't know because it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. So this is, I think these exercises on the wall, and I have another one here that I wanted to share of Akio, because it is very similar. Unfortunately, she posted it. I don't know if you saw it, but when she posted it sideways, and it was very difficult to see.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
She had rotated it.
Yeah. I mean, one thing, just I think we talked on the first show, just the distance from your toes to the wall. You know, you're talking entirely different difficulties. Like I could do the same thing what Kata does with I don't know how much in inches, but with some distance, but I couldn't as close, not even close to do it the way Kata does it. So even with these few moves, I can tell that he's a far better climber than I am. And it's really easy for you. I think this is what we talked in the first. It's very easy for yourself to see some progress.
And it's cool because it's so scalable that way.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, it's
in a way that climbing isn't a lot of the time. Like when you're 5 feet up on a slab, you can't really play around as much as you can on the ground. Like you can't really dial it forward or dial it back. So in a lot of ways, it's like creating a really good, for me, it's something that I'm going to end up using more frequently to learn some of this basic movement, because otherwise I think coaching and climbing tends to be really opportunistic. Like, oh, here's a climb that can teach you this. Let's try to like teach you through this climb, as opposed to like, here's some fundamental movement that's going to work with you forever, just so you can learn about flagging. Like just learn what your back leg does. Just learn what your knee does as it slides across the wall. Notice like what your hands are doing when you're generating momentum. And these are the kind of things that I feel like we've wanted really badly in our camps to like do. We always try to have something on the ground that's like teaching these fundamental things. And it's cool because like this time I feel like I'm putting so much more effort into like developing those ideas a little bit further. Here's another one from Akio, which is like pretty much it's the same thing, but the reason I picked it was because of the cueing that she's using with the tape. I don't know if you guys took a look at this one.
Yeah.
But even I think what's really interesting about the Zoom calls that we've been doing with the kids recently, or any sort of video calls, is that inherently like you can see yourself in the video in front of you, and you can watch other people. So I've been able to give like a really specific feedback that you wouldn't be able to give otherwise. But also I mean, not in this one, but you can watch and see like whether you're accomplishing your task. And her task is basically just to keep her, like, it seems like nose or mouth level with the tape. And it's like super simple, but it's really, really, really complicated if you try to do it. Did you take a look at this one, Enrico?
Yeah. And again, I think it's very interesting because you can measure, and you can start this week 3 inches off the wall, and then getting closer and closer, and and then you can start playing around with not only hip position but knee position, because you can try to again just move from a basic movement relate to flexibility and mobility into a more specific climbing movement. So as Udo posted recently, you can try to drop knee on the ground and on the floor, and you can try to drop knee keeping the feet in the same position and staying close to the wall. And so you have to work with the balance, with the hip position, just to make room for yourself to have a little bit more range of motion for the single arts, so legs or arms. So, and again, I think is very interesting because I think this unique period is allowing us, I think, to be more focused on, you know, creating better athletes through different drills, instead just being strictly related, as you were mentioning, to just climbing experience. Because of course we are climber and we coach and we set climb and boulder problems and we coach through climbing, but there's a lot of, you know, a lot of workouts, a lot of drills relate to climbing that can make first athletes better athletes, and then of course better climbers, because then they're gonna apply, you know, on the wall. And working on a symmetric situation can easily help in understanding better our body and work on it and have references and move forward.
Yeah. You can really tell how mindful, I mean, it's a little bit a cliche almost, but you can really tell how mindful Akio is about her preparation. Like,
yeah,
and
but
how much she takes her time and how deliberate she is.
Yeah, because again, I would say that, you know, we had this conversation multiple times with Al and with you for sure, but how you can expect to do this body weight transition from one leg to the other leg on two steep volumes with all the pressure about trying to top the most important boulder problem of your life or of your climbing day, if you are not able to do on the floor in your apartment. It's the same.
Yeah.
How you can expect to run and jump on a wall in a single try on the last 30 seconds of your timing in your performance, if you cannot kind of deal with a running ladder on the ground that is a athletic kind of basic movement for, you know, for just training for multiple sports, you know, is very important. And sometimes, of course, we are very focused on climbing because we are passionate, because we want to rock climb. But to be very good rock climber, very good competitive climber, you have to be first a good athlete, you know, a very well-rounded athlete, I think. And so those are a lot of examples that they are very cool, because we have time now to dedicate to these aspects and to get better coaches too. I think this is very, very important.
Yeah, let's see the remote coaches you guys have been doing. I'm really curious.
Yeah, let me find some. So very similar actually to what essentially we were just looking at. But if essentially we're doing something along the lines of what she was doing, so we can scale it, which is really nice. So initially we were doing stuff like just transitions from the knee standing up. And at this point, the cool thing is that we asked, okay, we get a little bottle cap, something that's very small, where you can put a lot of pressure on and put it on the ground, and then put your climbing shoes on. And you're trying to just transition from your knee to standing up on top of your foot. So that was kind of where we started. And then eventually it kind of goes towards the same idea with the bottle cap closer and closer to the wall, and just working on movement of standing up onto a small foot, and then continue the idea even further from like trying to do it from your knee. Same idea, just a little bit further, and then maybe just put something in front of the foot, around the foot, so you had to kind of reach around to get your foot onto the bottle cap to stand up. And so all of this stuff was like to each side, and you can kind of scale it so you can see here the idea is to generate all from the lower body. And so much of it is about like just understanding what the back leg is doing, what the front leg is doing, what the driving leg is doing, like, and we'd create little constraints. We'd say, okay, this time you have nothing to drive with your left hand. And it's really cool. It's been like, it's crazy to take just an idea like that and then just to drive it for an hour worth of content, like you wouldn't normally do that because you'd just be like, well, let's just climb. But I think during that hour of doing something like that, they learn so much about how to what to do, like just how to dead point on slab. And it was awesome. It was like some of the
That
most
looks
fun.
super. Yes, yeah. And so, how does this change how you will coach once the gym, once the academy is open again?
I mean, I think it already, like we already started doing things like that when we started taking the fiber, like when we took the plywood and just put foot chips on it, a lot more pragmatic. But even further, I think like just every space of the gym, not just the climbing wall, can be used to learn something, you know. And even further, I think if there's something, there's this approach I feel like really frequently of, if let's try a climbing move, and if somebody can't do a climbing move, that okay, well, let's just keep trying it over and over again until you figure it out. But the fundamental mechanics of it, like trying to regress it as much as possible to something on the ground where the only thing is, like, there's no risk, you're not worried about falling and hurting yourself. You're not like, it's not because you're not physically capable. It's more just like purely, okay, here are the like everybody there could kind of do the stand up. And basically that whole lesson started with, let's do a pistol squat. Okay, everybody can do a pistol squat. Like the plane, you have so many areas you can move, and just restricting it more and more and more. And then if I noticed that somebody was doing it and it looked really easy, like they did it first try super easily, I'd be like, okay, you put something in front of the foot so that it hides it a little bit and you have to pull with it more. And that's something that's like really hard to do when you have, 8 kids all climbing on the wall around you versus like a tile of people in front of you. So
Yeah.
it's really, it's cool. Like I
How,
think,
how, sorry, yeah, how was it for like you said, you did this exercise what we just saw for 1 hour? Like, were the kids tired after this hour, or did you, or could you still, how was that? Like, how is spending 1 hour on a bottle cap?
I think, well, that's the thing. It wasn't like an hour on the bottle cap. Maybe it was like 10 minutes, that, or like 10 to 15 minutes total where we ended up on the bottle cap. Because it started with basically like a warm up and then some mobility work to work through the ranges of motion. And it never really has, I think, like we'll say, okay, today you're going to need a bottle cap, like go find one. And it's kind of cool. It's like fun to try to come up with just something that you need that like seems unrelated. And I think contextualizing it is the really important part, and saying like, imagine, I'm always trying to say, imagine you're on this foot and you're reaching for this hold. And that's
Yeah.
usually how it gets cued. So I wouldn't say they were tired. I think maybe at the end of it, I would say that's like the really big challenge of coaching right now, is that you don't get some of that feedback that you normally get working with people, where you can tell whether or not like they're enjoying what you're doing, you know? But that's just the reality of it. Like a lot of times I'll be there and I'm like, I can't tell if I'm rambling on or not, or like if they understood it, because you're not getting that kind of like instant feedback.
Yeah,
They
sure.
might have been
Okay,
really
yeah.
tired. It's hard to know.
Yeah. No, but and did it feel just right, 1 hour, or
Yeah, I mean, a
because
lot of times.
I think like what we are usually in our coaching, we're wasting a lot of time.
Oh, definitely.
That is the other thing, that these sessions show you, like if you really want to work on one idea, then that can be condensed to even half an hour, or even 20 minutes can be a valuable session.
Yeah, and I think it like, basically the coolest thing about format like this and the way we've kind of organized it is that different coaches are teaching like different time slots, but there's no constraint of like, oh, this person has to go to work, so like we're going to pick you up at 4, or we're going to drop you off at 4 and then we're going to pick you up at 7. It's basically just like, here's the start time and then we're going to do whatever this activity for as long as it's engaging,
Yeah.
no more than an hour. And so it's so nice, because it's like, okay, well, if at this point something is just isn't interesting, we're going to stop. And I think that's something really And I think the other thing that I've learned is a couple of really big things. I know you know this, but I like to work. I'm pretty good at working on the fly, and I think that's one of my strengths. Is kind of like I'm an opportunistic coach. I see somebody that I'm like, oh, okay, I can help them in doing this. Let me take you over here. Let me show you this kind of where I can cue the movement for you. You can't do that. So you have to be a little bit more prepared. Otherwise, you struggle a little bit harder and even just for this conversation that we're having, if the less I prepared for having this conversation, the more meandering and less entertaining it is. And that's something that's really hard in this format, but it's making me a better coach because I'm learning how to like, okay, let's get to the point, explain what we're talking about, try to cue it in a way that I wasn't able to do it before. So
yeah. And you like even the session that we just show, you already have a follow-up session in mind?
Well, so every week, so that one's like movement, and every week we do something. I just try to think
but
of,
just like standing up on small things, like
oh, you mean like is there like the next progression? I don't know.
progression,
Sometimes,
like what?
yeah, I mean that's the thing. Like sometimes I come up with a plan. At the end of that one, I'm like, oh, it would have been fun to do that. Or sometimes it's like 10 minutes beforehand, and
Yeah.
that's one where it's like I should probably be open to more people being like, oh, well, you could do this. But like if you show somebody, I think that's like the really cool thing about the Instagram challenges is that it gets crowdsourced. So you show somebody a challenge and they say, oh, okay, here's the challenge, let me do it like a million different ways.
Yeah.
But Enrico's been also teaching classes, and I think I'm curious, Enrico, with how it's been for you, because I think everybody knows you're a very people person, and I think
Yeah.
transitioning.
I think, yeah, of course, is a different way. For me, the hardest part is, of course, all this technology going around because I'm sort of caveman and I don't really like technology in general. I don't really like all this stuff, but it's okay, and I have to adapt. And but yeah, more than this, I would say that I really like, what you were telling is for sure making me, and I would say making us better coaches, because you have, of course, to again adapt, learn, and understand how to communicate better and to be, more on point. I think one of the coolest part for me in coaching is just every time I have to adapt on my customer in terms of, athletes, level, member, whoever. And so it's very interesting and it's very challenging. And again, you can learn how to better coach a World Cup athlete doing private lesson with a beginner, because maybe with the beginner you have to be very, very understandable and straight, and then you can move all this knowledge on different categories and different situations. And I would say that I really like that you have to tell a lot of stories to me to make people more, and make, in this case, the kids more engaged. And especially, right now I'm coaching mostly conditioning classes. So, everything is related to, coordination and body workouts. And so to me, it's very fun to, explain why we are doing frog jumps, because maybe it looks like, oh, I don't need frog jumps. But if you think for a second that you are jumping from one wall to another wall and landing against, a climbing wall, you have to have a lot of control. So you cannot pretend and expect to jump around just laying forward with your body, and you have to have a good form. And so I really enjoy the, that I have to explain a lot of metaphor to try to make the kids more interest and understanding better why we are doing some kind of exercises. and same, sometimes try to make more dynamic the hangboard as a tool is pretty fun, and require a little bit more creativity. And I would say enjoy, because I can see that it's making me a better coach, and of course, as usual, I think I give a lot of energy, and I try to suck a lot of energy, because we need it, or at least I need it as a coach. And of course, I miss the kind of, let's say, the physical contact with the athletes, or kind of the physical interacting. But again, I really trust that right now, we have to keep physical distances, but not social distancing. And, coaching online is a good way to keep a social contact and communication, and is very important. And so I'm really enjoying it. And I think I have the feeling that I'm going to be back after this period on the regular coaching at the academy, being a better coach, because I'm going to have more tools to use. And so I'm pretty happy about that.
I've watched your lessons. I've sat in, and I think a lot of times I hang out just because it's fun to be there. And one thing that I appreciate is, like, same thing, you contextualize it really well in terms of when it's on the hangboard. It's not just a time, but it's like, imagine you're here, you're in the middle of a route, you're shaking out. And I think that's been really important to making it for the kids. So it's like it almost gives them a sense of, okay, I understand. And the hangboard sessions sometimes look more fun than some of my climbing sessions. So I think that's a really cool part. But then the other thing I'd say is also not worrying so much about the climbing specificity of it, because going back to what we talked about on the first episode, like, just the act of learning and process, I think, is valuable within itself. So I remember when we first started kind of like scheduling our stuff out, people were like, okay, well, what should I be teaching? I'm like, well, what do you feel comfortable? Like, what do you want to teach? What can you teach for an hour? I think, like, almost anything is probably going to be new. And for you, it was kind of, our conversation was, you had some background in some of that, like, in other sports, and a lot of other coaches didn't necessarily start climbing. Myself, I was a soccer player, and so any sort of fundamentals from whatever sport that you came from a background for that you can teach is really valuable, even for them, just to learn something. So a really example of this was, my wife is a dancer. She likes to teach dance, and she takes dance classes herself. And for one of the classes, we did like an 8 count of a dance routine that she made up. And it was really interesting to me, because I just didn't know, I had never done anything like that. And it was like rhythm, and in my head while I was doing it, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so similar to a lot of like coordination movement, where it's like, the cue that worked for me was the rhythm and a sound. I was like, pa, pa, pa. Like, that's what helped like cement the movement in my head. And she at some point, she said that, and I was like, oh, now it makes sense. And I was able to do it. And it's exactly the same, like on volumes. When I'm running around, I'm like, I want it to be pa, pa, pa. And sometimes that's the cue that gets it across. And so to me, like, I think one of the big things was just getting over the self-consciousness of like doing these dance moves, but like the reality of it was that learning it was beneficial. And I think like any sort of thing like that you can learn is going to be, or teach for whatever period of time, is going to be useful.
Yeah, I totally agree. Again, I think, it's already part of our philosophy at the academy too. And it's just, create first better athletes, and then better climbers. And sometimes, we have to use a lot of different backgrounds and knowledge from other sports to, canalize kind of the kids or whoever to the final climbing scenario, where to apply all the skills, So it's very cool. It's very interesting. And I have the feeling that, talking about our kids, they're going to come back, I would say, stronger for sure. They're going to be better climbers. I'm totally sure about that, because again, talking about the first podcast, we were talking about, I'm very anxious about, I'm going to lose all my strength. I'm going to lose all my climbing abilities, but I think it's not going to happen, especially if we are spending a good time as we are doing, or people are spending good time on training and improving in general. So we're going to be all better climbers for sure.
I have another video I can share too of something else that we've been doing, and I think maybe Udo, you can kind of give us your take on it a little bit, because essentially you've been doing this for a while as well. But we talked about this one of the other episodes. So two kind of non-climbing, this has basically been like non-movement, and I think it's been one of the more challenging ones to try to teach, is we've been doing kind of, one of them has been, we called it mind games, but it's kind of been sports psychology / video analysis, and every week it's just a little bit different. And one of the cool things that we've been doing is you can take these videos from, for instance, we have the Bouldering Japan Cup of 2020 in the final, and online observation takes these scans of the walls, and it's really provides a lot of depth and a lot of detail. And so we just work on essentially saying, okay, you guys have 2 minutes to kind of like imagine what the beta would be like and climb it through in your head. And then afterwards we watch a few different athletes go through it and see like, oh, how close did it match up to what you thought? And so this is kind of an example of that. In this one, we were talking about just reading beta, and I was trying to give them a little bit more of a perspective from like a route setting, and a little bit different than sequencing, which I think is what most of the athletes have. But basically I was just using like a Epic Pen, which is to annotate, although Zoom has its own annotation, and just as I was talking through it, kind of drawing on the screen. And you could kind of see that, like for that, I think it's really interesting. You can take a bunch of different videos, and there's a ton of them online. I have pulled up another one here. And the cool thing is that then afterwards you can kind of watch everybody, all the climbers go through it.
Super, yeah.
And I think in the past we wouldn't have done something like that necessarily, because we would have just been climbing. And I think it's really valuable for the climbers to start kind of being able to visualize themselves in a 3D space that they're not like necessarily able to just do, and then just learn to kind of connect that all together. And the reason I kind of brought it up is because, for instance, Udo, you've been doing this for a bit, and even just recently you posted like the rock stars technical analysis, and it's very similar.
This one, okay, yeah. Wait, yeah. This I posted. Oh, okay. YouTube, yeah.
And this is from 28. I'm like, Udo, did you not know? Did somebody take over?
So, yeah, but there was somebody climbing. So, how was this similar?
Well, I think just in general, like I think for athletes, there's so much footage already online that they can use that's underutilized in terms of just
totally no okay, I didn't make the connection, but,
yeah, sorry, I didn't make it. I didn't
but even like I don't know what you did with your group, like when you asked them to come up with solutions for these problems, but it's I don't know if you asked them to have a plan A and they maybe go all the way down to plan I or something. So it seems to be a ridiculous amount of solutions. This could be something, or you can ask them to find solutions for different animals. That would be depending, of course, how old the kids are, but you can always ask to find a solution for Tomoa and then one for Akio, like for different climbers, to have the same task to make it a little bit richer, and have more questions to ask. And also, how did your kids respond? Like, were they engaged?
I think that's something that I was going to bring up. So for something like this, I think it's a lot harder. One thing that I've noticed coaching through a platform like this, I think like I've always felt very confident if I was in front of a group and speaking to something like this. But with this new format, when it's so hard to know if people are as engaged about it, especially since people can turn off their cameras, like I can feel pretty self-conscious sometimes in terms of it almost makes me feel like a coach starting out again, where I'm like, I don't know if what I'm saying is landing in any way. And I think that's just interesting and hard to do, but they for sure, I think the way I could tell a lot of the times is that they're engaged, is that they're coming back and
yeah. No, I mean, like also in their responses, because I mean, like one thing we have to assume, of course, depending on how old they are, but if you give them the online presentation 3D image, and they are supposed to say what a good solution is, and then just imagine their solution, nobody climbs it their way.
Yeah.
There is an element that they might feel that they were not doing it the right way, not even the visualization. And I think this should be not an issue. So even in these little exercises, I think it's super important to keep them playful.
Yeah,
It's not about coming up with and you don't know, again, with the remote coaching, you cannot read like really small features in their face that would maybe give it away, or in their body language would give it away, that they maybe cannot relate to the exercise, or they feel even a little bit threatened. So of course that's a problem, but then you still like in terms of their response, you can tell by how they respond. Like if you suggest to come up with even 10 solutions, of course these solutions will be totally futuristic and most likely wouldn't work. But I think for these exercises, super important to allow yourself to go out to go into fantasy land and dream up things.
yeah. And I think that was been the challenge too. Now, I mean, just recently, as unknowingly, like I found out that other people can annotate on your video, and so that at that point I'm like, oh well, then we can do a lot more interactive stuff, because basically the way some of those videos have been working is like, oh, let me just show you, here's what I think like the climber is going to do, and then I would say, oh, like she did that, I didn't see that coming, that's pretty creative. But one analogy that I had was in that video we were working about was like them thinking about ending positions or starting positions and ending positions, and not getting so bogged down in like the sequencing necessarily, but more just like I'm trying to get to there, and that's like what and I said, imagine if I gave you, your challenge was you're under the table, you can't touch the ground, and then you have to get on top of the table. Like those are the only two things that matter. And then at that point you start thinking like, oh, here's all the strategies that I could have for getting on top of the table. And that was essentially like what I had explained, how I wanted them to think about it in that time, is I just want them to think, oh, here's like a kind of like a more stable position. Like, how do you transition from this kind of stable position to this kind of stable position? Can you identify the stable position? Like what seems like a stable position? Like what does that look like? And for me in that situation, I was like, okay, well, I need to learn a little bit more. I need to rethink and plan a little bit more exactly what you're saying. Like, how do I get them to have some time doing this on their own so that we can talk about it? And I think all of that is more challenging, but if you don't start at some point, then it's not going to go anywhere. So I think that's been like the really big plus.
Yeah, sure. Especially because I think that's the other point. So climbing is a pretty young sport, and so I think we are still learning a lot how to coach better. And I think, you know, as in a lot of different sports, there's tactic and technical sessions. So it's most likely it's gonna happen for climbing too in the future. I would say, you know, when you play soccer or you play basketball, you're not playing all the time the match or the game, or just sometimes you have to sit with your coach and you have to take a look on the tactics, and you have to take a look on the, you know, different details. And so I think is very important. Again, we can learn from this period that coaching in climbing is now just about climbing and climbing and climbing, and just use climbing as a tool, but we have a lot of different tools. And so we have to make our athletes more used to, you know, to different kind of sessions that they are not only related to climbing. Yeah. Or at least not just the climbing, the physical climbing kind of. I have a good session when I go home completely tired and bleeding from my, you know, with my fingers bleeding and whatever. It's just, there's a lot more involved, especially on the way to become a better athlete in climbing. So it's cool. I think it's a good experience for our kids, or in general, to kind of have a little bit of distance from regular climbing.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I think that's a good wrapping up point for today. Yeah, I think a takeaway essentially for a lot of people is it's not going to be perfect. It's very difficult to do something that feels like traditional coaching and something that we've been doing for a long time. And it's not just for the coaches. I think like if everybody wants to improve their own climbing in some way, they can. And you just have to be, like, I think what Udo was saying, the mindfulness of the exercises that we're doing, and the really unique aspect of it is like the regression and progression of very little exercises. And that's a skill that I think is often underutilized for coaching in general. Like once we go back to working in a gym, carrying that over is probably going to benefit the sport quite a bit, because it right now, I think if you take the brute force approach where it's like, well, if we just get them on enough climbs, they're going to learn the movement eventually. But I think there are some ways where we can build fundamentals, like Enrico was saying, where these are some movements that we know happen. Like this is what, like a lot of those things we did in that one class that on the wall are slab, like transitioning from your weight from one foot to the other is something that you're going to have to do multiple times.
Pretty much every time you climb.
Also, I mean, for me, the takeaway of this session is a lot how important communication is. You mentioned this all the time. Now with the remote coaching, we all have to reflect on how well we are communicating. You know, because we cannot read certain, as I said, body language and stuff like this. And I feel this is such a big part of coaching, or maybe even the biggest part. You know, like the communication and the cueing of moves. So again, I just want to say there's another huge opportunity, I think, for every coach to maybe rethink even or try out new things in communicating with your athletes.
Yeah, it's made it very clear to me like what my shortcomings are of like those things that I'm talking about, where if I relied quite a bit on being able to like pick something, see something and say, okay, here, like we're going to use this and we're going to take off with it. And you can't do that right now.
Yeah, even a quick demonstration, you know, like really like just there can be even a move that gives them some help. You know, like when you demonstrate a move, and there's really it's different now, so you cannot use it to the same extent.
Yeah,
but again, I think that's a fantastic, like even like cueing a move to stand up on a bottle. You know, it's so condensed, but you still like what you said about how, or I know how Enrico coaches. You know, a lot of really colorful vocabulary, things that are relatable, that provide context. That's even you can learn this like in the laboratory right now, like in a lab setting.
Yeah, it carries over. I think that's
Yeah,
the important thing.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
anything, and that's why if there's anything that you feel, I don't feel like it has to be a recurring thing where, okay, I'm gonna teach you. And I think that's the one thing that I forgot to mention is, for us, we're very fortunate that we have many coaches working on this, so they can all, like, it doesn't have to be me or Enrico just coaching 10 hours a week. It's like, if you coach one class a week, if you can build a network of coaches around you that are willing to do that and kind of say, okay, like, here's something that we're offering together, that tends to add a ton of value as well, just because you don't feel that burden of, like, I need to keep them engaged, not just for 1 hour of the week, but like a lot more period of time.
Yeah.
But if there's anything that you feel like you can teach, juggling, okay, is there anything that you feel like you can teach for an hour of time and work on keeping somebody engaged? That's such a valuable thing to work on as coaches. It's going to carry over, because if you can do it in this setting, I think you're going to have a much easier time once the people in front of you and you have all the tools available to you. So completely agree.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you so much, and I appreciate seeing you guys again.
Yeah,
Of
Stay
course.
safe.
Thank you. You too. Thank you all.
And
Ciao, ciao, Udo.
we'll see you at the next one. Okay, ciao,
Yes.
ciao.
Bye.
Thank
Ciao,
you.
ciao, guys. Take care.
Have a good night.
Have a good day. Bye.